What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. We are on our fourth and final set of notes for our Psychology of Personality unit. We're going to wrap up with the social cognitive perspective, and we'll talk a little bit about personal control that goes along with that. So, when we're talking about social cognitive, we're talking about obviously the social environmental factors, how they interact with our personal factors, the way we think are cognitive, and our personality or our behaviors. Right? They all interact and interchange and impact, our daily lives. So let's get into it and we'll talk about this final perspective. So the social cognitive ideals. Social cognitivists believe we learn behaviors from conditioning, observing, modeling, right? So they're kind of adding in those behaviorist aspects as well as observational learning. And they emphasize the importance of our mental processes, right? So it's a combination of behavioral and the cognitive perspective, right? Learning through rewards and punishments and observation, but as well as the way we think about those things that we see and adding that cognitive piece, right? They also focus on how we and our environments interact. Okay, so they're adding multiple layers here. So, in a difference from the trait perspective, which we just covered, they emphasize the interaction of our traits with our situation or our environment. Okay, trait theorists have been criticized for only looking at the traits and not considering environmental impacts on our personality. Well, social cognitivists are bringing in a little bit of both. They're bringing in the situation, the environment, and our traits to see how they interact. So one of the key psychologists here is Albert Bandura. We've heard of Albert before when we went over the Bobo doll experiment and observational learning, which matches up well here with social cognitive. And his big theory in this realm is something called reciprocal determinism. Okay? And he would say our personality is shaped by an interaction among our cognitive, our internal personal factors, our thoughts, our actual behaviors, and environmental factors. Okay? And he would say they're all interconnected and they all impact each other in different ways. And we'll see some examples on the next slide. But the way we think can be influenced by our environment and can influence our behaviors. Our behaviors can change our environment, can change the way we think, things like that. So it's not like a continuous circle. They are all impacting one another in different ways. So here's an example that might resonate with you. Hard work. Let's say you have this cognitive belief. Hard work will take you far, right? That's a value that you hold, and hopefully you do. So as a result, your behavior changes because of your belief. You study hard and you get good grades, right? That's our outward actions. And then because of that belief and that behavior, you're praised by your parents, you're admired by your friends, and you get attention from your parents and admiration from your teachers and things like that. That's your environment reinforcing your thoughts and behaviors. Okay? So they all have an impact on one another. And that's a positive example, right? But there's all different types of examples and how they can have an effect on each other. So there's three ways that we interact with our environments. Okay? One, different people choose different environments, right? Your personality is going to lead you to different areas, and people are going to want to do different things based upon their personality. So think of your friends. These individuals can influence the way you think about school, the music you like, the clothes you wear. Okay? The people you decide to associate yourself with can have a great impact on your life. There's a theory out there that your personality becomes the composite of the 5 people you spend the most time with. So take a second, think about that. Who you spend the most time with in your environment, right? You're becoming more unlike those people. They have a big influence on who you are as a person. 2, our personalities shape how we interpret and react to events. So depending on your disposition or your traits, you're going to react differently in certain situations. So people who are calm, some are anxious. Your reactions to an emergency is going to be different depending on your personality. Type A people, type B people, extroverts, introverts, emotionally stable, neurotic, right? All of those personality traits we talked about with trait theory, that's going to impact how you react to different events. And then we have our personalities help create situations to which we react. Right? How you treat others is often how they're going to treat you in turn. If you're nice, others tend to be nice to you. If you put bad energy out into the world, it tends to come back to you. That's kind of like an idea of karma, but it can be true, right? So we interact in these different ways through our behaviors, through our thoughts and actions, and through the environment that we choose to be in. Okay? And that's that reciprocal determinism idea. They all have an impact on creating and determining our personality and our day-to-day life. So a big piece of this is self-efficacy, because social cognitive is all about the way we think and perceive the world, and it's important that we understand how we perceive ourselves. And that's self-efficacy. So it's a person's belief about his or her skills and ability to perform certain behaviors. Okay? The greater a person's sense of self-efficacy, the more confident that person is in their ability to deal with life's challenges. Okay? So our self-efficacy has a powerful effect on our behavior, but it's not considered a trait. Why would that be? Okay, well, it can be understood only in relation to specific behaviors and situations. It's not generalized across situations. So remember, trait theorists would say traits remain stable across situation, but self-efficacy changes depending on the situation you're in and the task you're trying to complete and whether or not you believe you can do it. Right? And that's where it comes into the social cognitive perspective. So we also need to talk about personal control in this unit, because it has plays a big role in our social belief in ourselves and whether our personality and we can accomplish things. So personal control would be our sense of controlling or being controlled by the environment. We've spoken about this before with motivation, but the idea of how much control do you have, right? So a psychologist by the name of Julian Rotter came up with two ideas: internal locus of control and external locus of control. Again, this should be review from our motivation unit. But external locus of control, if you believe in that, it's the perception that chance or outside force determines your life and your fate and you have no control. Internal locus of control is the perception that one controls their own destiny and fate, and you make decisions that can impact and guide your life. So which one do you think is better psychologically? Take a guess. It's kind of like growth mindset. It's internal locus of control, right? You influence your life. And research on that shows that people with internal locus of control, they receive higher grades. They're less likely to succumb to pressure from others. They're more likely to engage in physical activity, and they're just generally more happy in their lives. Now, some possible limitations to this perception. You got to be careful, right? An internal locus of control is positive, but there are things in life that can be outside of your control that you don't need to be blaming on yourself constantly, right? There are outside factors that can impact you. And having that understanding and that realization is important as well. But controlling the things that you know you can control and understanding that you can control them is very important. So in addition to some of these personal control aspects, we're going to touch on another psychologist here named Martin Seligman. And he's done a lot of research on learned helplessness and optimism. So we'll get into each. Learned helplessness we talked about again in motivation a little bit, but it's the sense of hopelessness and passive resignation where you just kind of give up. Say, I can't do it. It's not going to happen. I have no control over this. I'm never going to finish. I'm never going to understand calculus, right? I'm never going to get out of this place that I'm in, this environment, right? I have no control over it. So when you're unable to avoid these repeated traumatic events from which one cannot or feels they cannot escape, you develop this sense of learned helplessness. Okay? You feel no sense of control over your situation, and oftentimes this starts to transfer over to other situations in your life, and it can have a snowball effect. So, for example, people who are given little control, like in prison or nursing homes, they experience a lowering of their morale and an increased stress, and oftentimes it develops into this sense of learned helplessness. Right? And that can have a massive impact on your personality and the way that you behave. Now, on the flip side, there's optimism, and this is Seligman's research also. But it's good to have a positive outlook on life, right? The glass half full outlook. But you also need a sense of reality, as excessive optimism can be detrimental to a person. Okay, so you want to have that positive outlook because it helps you get through life, and people with optimistic outlooks are generally happier and more successful. But an excessive sense of optimism can cause a person to be blind to life's risks and make mistakes that they wouldn't normally, right? It can lead to unwanted pregnancies, divorce, even dropping out of college because you're like, oh, everything's going to be fine and we don't need to worry about it, right? When in reality, there should be a little sense of, I need to figure this out. I need to sit down and determine what's going on here. rather than just going through life kind of blindly optimistic. Okay. Individuals with that abundance of optimism also tend to be overconfident when they're least competent at a task, right? So this is the people who have no idea what they're doing, but they're like, yeah, I'm going to handle that. I'm really good at it. And then they fail because they're not realistic. So you really need realistic optimism to be in the best place in life. All right. So again, we focused on this sense of self a lot with humanism, but it is really important with social cognitive as well, because understanding your own sense of self and placing your own cognitive thoughts into the process is important. So with social cognitive theory, the sense of self is our organizer of our thoughts, feelings, and actions, right? And that's the cognition piece. Important to this part, the sense of self, is our self-esteem. We touched on self-concept with Carl Rogers in Humanism and your ideal self versus real self. Well, self-esteem is your feeling of self-worth. And people who feel good about themselves, they have fewer sleepless nights, do not conform as easily, are more persistent during difficult tasks, and are less shy and lonely, and generally happier. Okay, so think back to that sense of self article that we read and how you can improve your self-concept and your self-esteem and make your life, generally happier and more beneficial. There's also this self-serving bias aspect of self. And we'll get into this more so in social psych at the end of the year. But our readiness to perceive ourselves favorably is a self-serving bias. Okay? In this instance, people accept more responsibility for the good deeds they do than the bad, and they're more likely to prescribe those good deeds as part of their personality. And most people see themselves as better than the average, right? They're more likely to give themselves credit for the good than the bad and say, yeah, I'm a good person, and kind of leave out those things that maybe are evidence to the contrary. That's self-serving bias. So our last thing to consider with social cognitive theory is culture and self. So we have individualism versus collectivism, and we've talked to this throughout the year a little bit in different contexts. But individualists, they place more emphasis on the independent self. These are Western cultures. You have control over your life. You are the only person who can improve your life. Yourself is defined by personal values, personal goals, and personal attributes, right? It's very self-centered, self-focused. In collectivist cultures, more Eastern cultures, Japan's a great example, there's more emphasis on collective self, the good of the society. Your self is defined by connections with your family, your friends. Goals of the group have higher priority than individual goals. So when speaking about social cognitive theory, individual societies versus collectivists would just have different emphases on the reciprocal determinism aspects of behavior, environment, and your personal cognitive thoughts. So to wrap this up, a few criticisms of the social cognitive perspective. Some people would say they focus too much on the situation or the environment, that it fails to recognize a person's inner traits, right? So they're getting the opposite criticism of trait theory, and they're saying, well, you're focusing too much on the environment and people's situation, and you need to focus a little bit more on their internal traits as well. So this doesn't necessarily look at the influence of our unconscious motives. It doesn't take into account that psychoanalytic, psychodynamic theory, our emotions, or the pervasive traits that many psychologists also believe influence our behaviors. So they're kind of ignoring some of the major pieces of other personality theory that some would argue need to be included. Okay, so that wraps up our unit on personality. We'll do some activities in class again to look at your own personal control and analyze things like that. But if you have any questions, please let me know.